tell you when this project started. It started really with Thomas Kinsella, the poet, and I was doing the study in the English department, or the Anglo-Irish Studies department in UCD. And it really started from the fact that I was always interested in Thomas Kinsella in his poetry. And when I found out along the way that his best friend was Sean O'Riordan, and he's written some famous poems about O'Riordan, some of the Pepper Canister Press series, two of them were about O'Riordan, but that he also he was Whittaker's private secretary in the Department of Finance. And that struck me as, quite an interesting connection between three people. So I looked into it a little bit more, and they do have quite a lot in common. They were obviously different ages. Kinsella would have been older than Whittaker. So Whittaker would have been older than Kinsella and O'Riordan. Kinsella and O'Riordan were kind of pals in Dublin in their 20s during the 1950s and 60s. They didn't live in a flat together, but they did know each other quite well. They hung around, as they would say now, and they would drink together and all the rest of it. Now, unfortunately, O'Riordan's drinking just got too much for Kinsella, and he didn't break it off or anything like that, but he just got annoyed with O'Riordan. But the connection that they had in my opinion, was quite interesting. They were all very bright, intellectually quite bright. They had done well in their school and in their university exams. They were all intensely nationalistic. Kinsella more so than the others, but they were all quite nationalistic. Kinsella was actually, I did interview him a couple of times. He disagreed with the Good Friday Agreement on the grounds that it was selling the country down the Swanee, and it wasn't taking account of our claim on Northern Ireland. But they were all quite nationalistic. They all had fluent Irish, which is quite interesting. And the connection, I suppose, I've described the connection between Whittaker and Kinsella. Kinsella was his private secretary. And Kinsella was ill one time in hospital, and Whittaker came to visit him and said, "What's all that papers on his on his bed?" And he was looking at old Irish translations of poems. And Kinsella said, "Why don't you take some time off and study that in more detail and do a translation of the Táin yourself?" Now that got me back to, there's one of Kinsella's lines, which has always struck me as the most interesting of all, is, "And I always remembered who and what I was." And that is quite important. A lot of his poetry involves going back into the past, into his family, but also into Irish history. And he became very interested in the bardic poems and in translation of ancient Irish poems. And to some extent, he's obsessed, I don't mean that in any pejorative sense, but he's very influenced by the fact that the Irish tradition is a broken tradition. And he explains that the divided sort of self, not so much self as the divided tradition, that it was broken because in the 19th century, we gave up a language. And in giving up a language, we gave up our past, effectively. And if you stop speaking the language that has been there for generations, you lose not just the words, but a whole historical sense of the past, because it all feeds in. So a lot of Kinsella's poetry is involved in trying to delve back in to overcome the barrier of the loss of language in the 19th century and go back before that and see what lessons, what influences on us today derive from the past. And he believes that everybody is carrying around with them influences from the past. And that's quite a common idea in many respects. I would just read out one quotation, if I can find it here, from somebody completely different. "Our imaginations are inhabited by ghosts. The past haunts us, but to change our lives for the better, we need to understand that fact better. The mind is a refuge for ideas dating from many different centuries, just as the cells of the body are of different ages." Now, Kinsella, he doesn't quote, that's Theodore de Zeldin, totally different writer. Kinsella doesn't quote him at all, but I think that idea sums up Kinsella's idea that if you understand the past better, you will understand your present better. And to understand your present is the only way that you can get to a future. So the Kinsella articulated that more than Whitaker or O'Riordan. But there was another connection between the three of them. They were very ambitious for Ireland. Now, this was a time when Ireland was seemingly heading for extinction. The Vanishing Irish was a big book in 1954, and somebody sarcastically said you could actually predict when there'd be only two people left in Ireland, and with any luck there'd be a man and a woman. But the emigration was happening so fast. 3 out of every 4 people born in the 30s and 40s emigrated in the 50s. So emigration was at a very high level. Self-confidence was down to nothing. And Whitaker was very significant here because most of the civil service had been there since the foundation of the state, or a lot of them had. They were very old, very conservative, very set in their ways. And they weren't worried about emigration. They thought emigration was actually a safety valve, that the more people emigrated, the less trouble you were likely to have in Ireland, because inevitably the more radical people would emigrate. So Whitaker was appointed Secretary to the Department of Finance, which is the most important department in the country, at the age of 39, which was unprecedented. That was very unusual. And he quickly grasped the seriousness of the situation. And they all had another thing in common. They were all very brave. And he went to De Valera, who at that time was the legendary figure, the Prime Minister, and said, if you don't do something, we will only have one choice: to go over to London and ask to be readmitted to Great Britain. Now, for a civil servant at the age of 39 to say that to this legendary boss was quite extraordinary, and to some extent shows the seriousness of the situation. So that led him to the first program for economic expansion, which effectively meant opening Ireland out to the world. And I would argue that O'Riordan also immersed in Irish music, and he also opened up Ireland to the world by reinventing traditional Irish music to some extent. And he was heavily influenced. So Whitaker was influenced by French planning. There was no planning in the Department of Finance, or none that I would be aware of. French planning was a big thing in the 1950s. A lot of people were interested in it. And he studied that and used, some of the lessons. O'Riordan was interested in jazz, and the jazz ensemble idea he recreated with Ceoltóirí Cúlin. And that gave Irish music an incredibly modern kind of feel. And Kinsella was interested in Pound, was a big influence on. So he looked outward to American poetry and to Jungian psychology for investigating his past. So they all looked outside Ireland for inspiration, and they combined a deep sense of Irish culture and the Irish language and Irish history with the best of overseas influences. And the idea was that they would merge. Now, they didn't do this I'm not saying they did this consciously, but in looking at their lives, it's fairly obvious that that's what they were doing. They were intensely ambitious for the country, in the way that an awful lot of the public sector were at the time. And one of the things I go through is that, we had a very, very innovative public sector at the time. I don't want to be rude to anybody at the moment, but I think, over the last 20 years, the gap in salaries between people in the public sector and people, let's say, in finance or high tech has got so wide that the brighter students have tended not to be as interested in the public sector as they would have been in the 1950s. In the 1950s, a lot of these people were educated by the Christian Brothers, particularly Whitaker was, Kinsella was, and I think O'Riordan was as well. And the Christian Brothers' idea was that you would educate the brightest people to take the best jobs in the public service. And they did, and they were highly innovative. And one of the points I wanted to make in the thesis was that there is an over adulation of the entrepreneur at the moment, in my opinion, in Irish society. And there wasn't enough credit given to the level of creativity and innovation of the generation of public sector people at that time, particularly those who were running semi-state bodies, or whatever they were called at the moment. But there were state bodies, highly innovative people. But get back to Kinsella and the past. He wanted to understand this. He wanted to break through the barrier of the language loss in the 19th century and figure out what Ireland meant and what, how had Ireland come about, what traditions they were. He was very interested in the bardic tradition. One would have to say one of his main interests in the bardic tradition was that the Irish filí, or poet, in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, well, 16th, 17th century, had far more power in their community than the poet would have had in 20th century Ireland, certainly in the 1950s. Obviously, things changed with the emergence of the Northern Ireland poets just at the time of Kinsella's emergence as a poet. And I'm talking about Heaney, Mahan, Montague, people like that, which was slightly unfortunate for Kinsella. And he did feel, there's no point in denying, he felt quite bitter about the fame of these Northern Ireland poets, which actually obscured his progress as a poet. There was partly that, partly when he went into his Jungian descent into his own self and family, he lost a lot of his audience. And he went to America, to Philadelphia. I'm not sure he went there first. He certainly ended up in Philadelphia, in academia in America. But getting back to the main point, they were all bright people, highly nationalistic, wanted to do the best for their country, in a country in dire straits. And they all wanted to look at what could be extracted from the past to be combined with the best of ideas from around the world to create a new Ireland. And to some extent, they succeeded. Obviously, I mean, I would argue that it was the first program for economic expansion from Whittaker that kick-started what eventually became the boom of the 1990s. There are people like David McWilliams, the current pop star economist, who would disagree with that and say this was all nonsense. These guys were useless. Ireland only started to boom when the entrepreneur took over in the 1990s. I think that's rubbish. I think the Whittaker's generation laid the foundations for our subsequent prosperity. Kinsella, O'Riordan was a huge influence on that, because he gave people a lot of self-confidence. Irish music was not regarded very highly by Irish people in the 1950s. I mean, I was there, I know. The excitement of Bill Haley coming to Dublin and extraordinary outburst of people dancing in the aisles in a cinema for a very polite, fairly acquiescent population was unbelievable. But I think it's Philip King, the guy who started the Other Voices in Dunlop in Dingle, makes the point that when O'Riordan had, when Misha Éire came out, the film, which was hugely important, and then Kiltorley Coolan, and then there was a big concert in the Shelburne, and he has this line about, and women from Fox Rock in their fur coats came to listen to Irish music. And it was just, how amazing it was that Irish music suddenly became. And what it was that it had always been highly sophisticated, but O'Riordan reinvented it for the 20th century. And subsequently, even people like Bono will admit that he was influenced by O'Riordan. Now, the conduit there would have been Horselips, which are a very influential pop group, but they were all influential. In a way, Kinsella was kind of a bit marginalized by his descent into the underworld of his own personality and of history, but he remains a significant poet. And you get a lot of people that I would know, quite a few of the poet community. And although they don't always understand Kinsella, nobody messes with Kinsella. You get even people criticizing Seamus Heaney. I mean, Seamus Heaney's been very lucky in his critics, like Eamon Dunphy and people like that. But nobody messes around with Kinsella. He's very tough. He's quite dark, and everybody admires him, even though they may not buy his stuff and read it. But he's a unique character. And his later poetry, he's now 94. He lives very close to me, although I interviewed him once or twice. He's quite grumpy, but at 91 or 2, you're entitled to be quite grumpy, I think. His beloved wife died a couple of years ago, and she had been ill all her life. One of the reasons why he went to America was to get hospitalization treatment for her, which he couldn't have got in Ireland. And she was a very calming influence on her. Eleanor was. She was a well-known Dublin beauty in the 1950s. And it shows the force of his personality that he actually attracted someone who was a well-known beauty in Dublin, would known a lot of the artistic and intellectual community in Dublin, but she picked this kind of obscure guy. And just one final point, I think I'm coming up to 20 minutes. He's also unusual in that he came from a working class background. For all the sort of cultural whatever of poetry, they tend to be quite middle class, a lot of poets. He came from a very working class background in the center of Dublin. And in one of his most extraordinary poems about his father was a trade union activist in Guinness and tried to form a union there. And he mentions, he wrote a brilliant Pepper Canister full-length poem about the father called The Messenger, which was actually a parody of a Jesuit, I think, religious magazine called The Messenger, which was in a lot of Irish homes at the time. But he does mention the fact of being dragged out of a packed church at the age of 10, which would have been something around 1940. So Ireland was in the grip of an extraordinary religious kind of thing in the 1930s and 40s, dragged out of the church halfway through a mass because his father objected to the priest criticizing godless Russia. And that must be a very traumatic experience for a kid to be dragged out in the middle of all the neighbors and, hundreds of packed church. But that was, and it's a mark of Kinsella's stubbornness that he took his father's political views, although he didn't articulate a left-wing perspective in his poetry, although he was kind of bitterly critical of a lot of materialistic and all that kind of stuff, but he didn't necessarily take a kind of socialist position. Program for economic expansion, we had this incredible success, and we were one of the most successful countries in Europe and all the rest of it. And suddenly we had this bloody crash, which a lot of countries had the Great Recession in 2008, but we had the worst of all. We had been incredibly self-confident for a while, and then suddenly, through our own messing with property and stuff like that, we had this enormous crash. So I had to quickly and say, okay, if these guys were alive today, the three men were alive today, what would they contribute to a third revival? And I tried to kind of work that out. And really, I went back to and I always remembered who and what I was, and said, first of all, we need a better sense of who and what we are. And in that sense, history becomes quite important. There's another interesting book by Finbar Bradley, Capitalizing on Culture, Competing on Difference. And he makes the point that we're very bad at understanding. We haven't taken the lessons of Kinsella and O'Riordan and Whittaker. We're very bad at history. We actually stopped. I think history vanished from the bloody curriculum in school. And Finbar makes the point that in Finland, every kid leaving school knows and understands intimately the Kavala, I think it's called, which is their national odyssey from ancient literature, whereas nobody in Ireland understands the Táin. They've hardly heard of it, and they certainly haven't read it, and they certainly would know very little about it. So that kind of needed to be corrected. That was one point. The sense of rededication of the public sector was another one, which is, again, very important now. In spite of globalization and the whole, necessity for, I suppose, for economic growth, there needs to be a more strategic input, the sort of input that Whittaker inspired in the late 1950s. We need that again. We need to navigate between very tricky currents as a small country. We need, obviously, to be much closer to Europe, and that means speaking much more European languages for a start. We need favors from Europe at all times. And when I say favors, I don't mean going on bended knee, but being trusted and being, seen as a willing participant in the European project. I think Kinsella and certainly Whittaker and O'Riordan would have agreed with that. I came around to the view that to correct a lot of the problems in our society, the philosophy of civic republicanism is probably something we should look at much more. And that has nothing to do with Irish republicanism, by the way. It goes from Aristotle through to Machiavelli, actually. And in fact, the leading civic republican philosopher in the world today is Philip Pettit in an American university, but he is Irish. And he, in fact, in the student revolution in UCD, the Gentle Revolution in the late 1960s, there was a book called The Gentle Revolution, and it was edited by Philip Pettit. So there is a strong civic republican tradition in Ireland. I think it's even more important now than when I wrote that back in 2008, because in 2008, nobody thought democracy was under threat around the world. Whereas in actual fact, everybody is now saying that it is under threat. There are 25 countries have been lost to democracy between the year 2000 and today. So you've got democracy, and there's less faith in democracy in surveys around the world. There's only a minority of American students apparently think that democracy is necessary. And given the way democracy is going in America, you can kind of probably see why. But it's not just in America. There has been a declining faith in it. And the only way to get that back is the sort of civic republicanism that Whittaker, Kinsella, and O'Riordan practiced in their own lives. But we need to get back to that now. And to be fair, and this is going to probably surprise you and maybe annoy some of you, the one Irish politician, and I wrote about this because he was obviously prominent at the time when I was writing the thesis, the one Irish politician who kind of understood that was Bertie Ahern. And he set up a task force for active citizenship in 2004, which reported in 2007 and got buried under an avalanche of ghost estates and financial crisis and all the rest of it. But it actually would be worth going back to. And the point being that active republicanism requires an active participation. And that kind of pisses people off to a certain extent. They don't want that. It's too many meetings and all the rest of it. But it's become a fashionable subject. And I'm not saying that I started it in any way, but there's a revival of interest in it because of the problems in democracy. Evidence, they all stem from the 2008 recession, the subsequent austerity, the fact that wasn't explained all that well to citizens, and the fact that citizens started revolting. And Trump and Brexit are two classic instances of what happened as a result of that. And unless we get back to some kind of civic republicanism, which, as evidenced by Whittaker's life and the other two, I'll just give you one example to show you how far removed Whittaker's ethos was from today. He said to me when I interviewed him that he was talking about a meeting that he had with some people, and it ran over time. So he rang his wife from his desk. He had a phone, on no mobile phones, obviously. He rang his wife from his desk, and he said to a guy, "Look, I have to ring my wife. I'm going to be a bit late." So he rang the wife and said, "I'm going to be a bit late." And then he put his hand in his pocket and took out a couple of pence and put it in a box beside the phone. And the guest who was there at the meeting said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, that was a private call. I have to pay for it." Now, can you imagine in 2020? Anyone doing that, particularly, regardless of whether it's civil service. So the ethos was quite different. And I'm saying we do need to get back a little. I'm not saying we get back to exactly that, but the spirit that moved Whittaker and Kinsella and O'Riordan, we need to get back to that a little bit. Because as I said, we are going to be more dependent on the brightest talent going into the civil service in the next 10 years than we have been for a while, because we have very tricky waters and people who with a strategic cast of mind, and we need to encourage that. So that was one point. I think in order to do that, you're going to have to correct a democratic deficit, which Kinsella wrote about all through his life. Kinsella constantly engaged in public affairs. He was very active on the Wood Quay controversy. He wrote about the appalling nature of a lot of the damage that was done from Dublin. He wrote about the kind of he wrote about the corruption in the county councils 10 years before it ever hit the newspapers. And we were the generation of positive disgrace. I can't remember the other lines, but he was writing about that all the time, all through his life. And in that, he was very influenced by the bardic tradition. I think I mentioned earlier that he was envious of people like Egon O'Rahala, who would have been in the 17th century, I think, who had the ear of the ruling princes, classes, whatever, in Irish society at the time. And he felt that poets do not have the ear of the ruling classes of society at the moment, but that he thought it would be a good idea if they did have. Now, that's obviously self-serving from his point of view, but he did have a point. And constantly, his poems into the year of marginal economy in 2008, he's still writing about that and still giving out about some of the problems. And he's sort of almost given up now. He's got two prayers. He's not a religious man. But the last time I interviewed him, he said he thought the Sermon on the Mount was absolutely brilliant and should be a template for anybody, whether they're religious or not. And that he didn't believe in Jesus as a God, but he thought he was a pretty cool character in his teachings. And that was the way he dealt with it. So he was very active. He not active politically in being a party member, but he was very active politically in his writing. O'Riordan, unfortunately, we don't know what he would have done because he died very young. He died in London. The nurse in the hospital where he died had to put something on when he died, and put him as 70 something. He was actually 39 or 40. He looked so wasted by the amount of drink that was involved. So Kinsella was bitterly disappointed, quite angry with O'Riordan for wasting his talent like that. But he did do a remarkable job for this country in his music. And even, the Irish Mass even is probably the one that most people know still today, because there wouldn't be, the Misha era stuff wouldn't be as well known. But the Irish Mass is still people's kind of first choice in a lot of ways.